Hi, this is Miss Hardy. I am standing here in front of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline to tell you a little bit about the history of the pipeline and how it came to be built. This is going to be a short lecture because guess what? It is about 27 degrees below zero right now, but it's kind of perfect because it's an illustration of some of the conditions that workers had to contend with while building this pipeline. So why was there a pipeline to start with? Well, this pipeline is transporting oil from the fields near Prudhoe Bay up near the Arctic Ocean at the very northern tip of Alaska. Now, oil was known to be there for hundreds of years before ever there was a thought of a pipeline. In fact, the Inupiat people near in that area actually used the oil-soaked peat of the tundra for fuel, for heating and lighting for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years before Europeans ever came near Alaska. But the oil fields around Prudhoe Bay and the North Slope, they became part of the United States Naval Petroleum Reserve starting in the 1920s. So there was a knowledge of oil fields here in Alaska from that period. But because of their remoteness, hundreds of miles of inaccessible tundra, the frozen wilderness of Alaska, these oil fields were never really exploited for decades after they became part of the petroleum reserves. That started to change in the 1950s. Alaska became part of the global petroleum market. In 1957, the first commercially successful oil well was drilled near Kenai, which is in the southern part of Alaska, and it became successful. Other oil wells in that area around Kenai followed, and by 1968, a company known as ARCO began drilling exploratory wells in Prudhoe Bay, showing that it was in fact an incredibly successful petroleum reserve with billions of barrels. In fact, the North Slope Prudhoe Bay oil fields are the largest oil reserve in North America. But there's still the problem of transport. There's billions of barrels of oil sitting in the ground in the permafrost up there, but it's hundreds of miles away from the nearest transportation hubs. So there were questions of how could we exploit it. The first option was a pipeline, but no pipeline had ever been built long enough to get the oil out of Prudhoe Bay and get it to the markets. There were some other considerations. Boeing suggested using aircraft, massive oil tanker aircraft to transport the oil. That would not have been very practical. There was the proposal of using submarines, tanker submarines to transport the oil underneath the Arctic ice cap, as well as the thought of using ice-breaking oil tankers. But all of those options were either impractical or not a viable long-term solution. So the pipeline, as difficult as it would be to build, became the most, the option with the most potential. So the pipeline would need to be nearly 800 miles in length. That's an incredibly long pipeline. It would also have to transit some of the most rugged and brutal and inhumane territories, environments in the entire world. So it was going to be difficult, but it was the best solution. But it would be very expensive. In June 1969, the TAPS, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, which consisted of several different oil companies coming together to form a non-incorporated company to try to figure out a solution to it, filed a permit with the United States Department of the Interior for the right-of-way to build a pipeline from Prudhoe Bay up on the North Slope to Valdez in southern Alaska on the Prince William Sound. And from the beginning, there was opposition to it. There were two main groups of opposition. There were environmental groups concerned with the impact it would have on the environment, as well as Native Alaskan groups. Some of the environmental concerns had to do with the effect of a pipeline and the necessary highway to go alongside the pipeline, the impact that would have on very slow growing tundra plants and animals, as well as the impact of a highway that would be there forever. Native opposition had to do with issues over ongoing land claims for Native groups whose land had been taken by the United States and their long pursuit to get it back, as well as their concern that it have an impact on their way of life. So those lawsuits filed by those groups managed to put a halt to pipeline building until 1972. But on October 17th, 1973, something very important happened, which will be discussed elsewhere in your textbook. But what I'm talking about is the Arab Oil Embargo. The Organization of Arab Petroleum Producing Countries announced an oil embargo on the United States. That meant that no country that was a member of that group would sell oil to the United States due to the United States' support for Israel in its Yom Kippur War. So all of a sudden, this has an enormous impact on the United States. There is gas rationing, there are gas shortages, the price of gasoline rises. There is the spectacle of lines forming at United States gas stations, at drivers being restricted to when they could purchase gas based on their license plate. This has an impact on the U.S. economy. It also has an impact on U.S. oil production. And it dramatically increases public support for the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. So on November 16th, 1973, Richard Nixon signed into law the Trans-Alaska Pipeline Authorization Act. This is a bill that basically removes all the legal barriers to construction, gives financial incentives for the construction to go forward, and it basically says, get this pipeline built right now, we need it. So the oil companies signed the deal that would allow construction to begin on January 23rd, 1974. So now January in Alaska is really cold. It's also cold in December when I'm filming this. So construction did not actually begin on the pipeline until March of 1974. Now, considering the enormous technical, environmental, engineering challenges that it took to build it, it really happened incredibly quickly. It took just over 3 years to build 800 miles of pipeline from Prudhoe Bay to the northernmost ice-free port in North America, that is Valdez on the Prince William Sound in Alaska, where oil tankers would come and pick up the oil. So the pipeline, it had to cross 3 mountain ranges, the Brooks Range, the Alaska Range, and the Chugach Range, over 30 rivers, including the Tanana River. Here in the background, this bridge goes over the Tanana River. It is a suspension bridge over the Tanana. Now, Alaska, most of the land in Alaska is subject to permafrost. That means the ground never reaches a temperature above 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So the pipeline could not be built underground for most of its length, because if it was built underground, the hot oil flowing through the frozen ground. So my last attempt at videoing this turned off a little suddenly, and that would be because it was 27 degrees below zero, and my video camera decided it was too cold to keep on going. So that's just another example of how extreme the conditions can be in Alaska. So I'm picking back up where I was talking about the permafrost, the frozen ground that made it impossible to put the Alaska pipeline underground for most of its length. So it is above ground, raised up above the ground with intricate systems designed to keep it from melting the ground and causing environmental issues. So as the pipeline was being constructed from 1974 to 1977, it required thousands of workers. So at a time of recession in the rest of the United States, there were thousands of high-paying, very good-paying jobs to be had in Alaska. So there were boom towns. The towns of Valdez and Fairbanks almost doubled or even tripled their populations seemingly overnight. Now, those towns like Fairbanks, Valdez did not have the infrastructure to deal with this massive influx of population of workers, of people with money in their pockets to spend. So vices followed along: prostitution, alcoholism, gambling. All of those things were issues that towns in Alaska dealt with as these thousands of workers showed up to help build this incredible undertaking. Now, this pipeline, it has had to cross three mountain ranges in its length, and it's just an incredible feat of engineering. It is made with 48 inches pipe that is 48 inches in diameter, so that's 4 feet. It's 4 feet thick, but the walls of that pipe are only about a ½ inch thick everywhere along the line. So even though it had to deal with incredibly harsh weather, harsh terrain, difficult engineering problems, it took a little over 3 years to finish the 800 miles of pipeline from Prudhoe Bay to the port of Valdez, that northernmost ice-free, year-round port in the United States. The final weld of the pipe was put in on May 31st, 1977. And the first oil flowed through the pipeline starting in June 1977. There were some issues, some leaks, problems as things got up and running, and it took nearly 2 months for the first oil to reach Valdez. But the first tanker carrying oil from the pipeline left Valdez and sailed through the Prince William Sound on August 1st, 1977, beginning a flow that would lead to massive revenues for the state of Alaska, as well as better oil stability, energy stability for the United States. So Alaska benefited greatly in many ways from the construction of the pipeline. The state of Alaska had the highest rate of personal income tax in the nation before the pipeline began to flow. After the pipeline, Alaska completely eliminated all personal income and property taxes, instead relying for most of its revenue on taxation of oil revenues from the state. That money went into something that's called the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is essentially a savings account for the state of Alaska. And since the early 1980s, the interest from that fund has been paid out to residents of Alaska in the form of what's called the dividend, that every Alaskan resident receives yearly a percentage of the interest from those revenues. So it was a massive boon for the state of Alaska. One historian of Alaska has even said that the North Slope oil fields, Prudhoe Bay, is more valuable than every other thing that has ever been taken out of the state of Alaska since the beginning of time. Fish, furs, trees, all forms of other forms of mining, including gold, everything Prudhoe Bay outweighed that in significance. And since it was completed in 1977, the Alaska pipeline has transported more than 17 billion barrels of oil to the port at Valdez. And it has not been without its controversy. In 1989, an oil tanker known as the Exxon Valdez ran aground on a reef in the Prince William Sound, leading to a massive oil spill that caused devastation to the wildlife and the environment of that pristine area. But that wildlife has recovered, and steps were put in place to prevent that happening again. To this day, oil continues to flow through the pipeline to Valdez, where it is put onto tanker ships, carrying it to the rest of the world. So that's a little bit about the history of the Alaska pipeline.